qua required to speak, and also the Hispanics who are given special rights as victims of colonialism, and they use their language with impunity, and in fact, as recipients of special rights. Whenever I am introduced as the leader of the paleo-conservative movement, I always point out there are only about 2 people who have survived, and both of them, including myself, are now past 70 years old. So it seems to be doing as well, I suppose, as something like the Society of Gustav Adolf or the Flat Earth Society. There are not too many of us around. And for those who want to discover why we have become indeed a dying breed, I would suggest that you read my books on the conservative movement, one of which is available now in French with a long postface, which I prepared explaining why American conservatism is today dominated by neoconservative ideas, and why it has ceased in any essential sense to be a conservative movement of any kind. It is now well to the left, I suppose, of the classical liberal framework of the 19th century. But the topic on which I'm supposed to address you is different from this, although in some ways it is related, and that concerns what is called cultural Marxism. The Germans have a statement that die Kulturmarxismus, das war entweder das war als Begriff oder als Schimpfwort, das war gelten, das war, aber das war das war als beides, das war auch, das war gelten. It can also serve as both a Schimpfwort, an insult, and also as a begriffliche Bestimmung. As a well-defined concept. And as I always tell people, that cultural Marxism has a kind of negative connotation by now, and it is used very often as a Schimpfwort, as well as a derogatory term. In fact, in the 1920s or 1930s, if one were to approach a cultural Marxist or a member of the Frankfurt Schule and say, "Are you a cultural Marxist?" the person probably would have said yes. I mean, there would have been no problem. It's only because in the 1930s you get terms like the cultural Bolshevismus, cultural Bolshevism, and so forth. And then the fact that some of the Nazis use this word in a derogatory way, it becomes eventually a derogatory term. And I like to tell people, I think the word cultural Marxist is descriptive, not just derogatory, because what these people set out to do in the 1920s when the Frankfurt Schule, the Frankfurt School, is established in Frankfurt, then when it was afterwards what they set out to do in the United States when they come as exiles and reestablish themselves at Columbia University, and finally when they go back to the Universität Frankfurt in the early 1950s and reestablish themselves there, they wish to approach Marxism as a cultural and aesthetic concept. Okay. Now the view is sometimes expressed that once you move away from the socio-economic the essential concept, which is socioeconomic, in what sense are you Marxist? Because this is the Grundlage, the foundation of Marxism, right? It is socioeconomic. And what they are doing is insisting that culture is significant, is the determining factor in the preservation of a bourgeois capitalist society. So in a sense, they're sort of standing Marxism on its head. And this is a criticism which I fully share, and it was made by none other than Joseph Stalin, but I still share this view that cultural Marxists are not serious Marxists. In the traditional Marxist sense, what they represent is a Marxist heresy, and not to be to hold back about this, it is an anti-Marxist heresy. I mean, there are some forms of heresy which I think go beyond being simply a deviation from an orthodoxy, but which represent an antithetical position, right? Somebody was mentioning to me in the early church of the Gnostic heresy, which the Gnostic heretics see the Old Testament as the work of the devil. That is because they totally deny the doctrine of creation. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, they're all based. So when they're going to throw this away, well, in the same sense, what the Marxists do, what the cultural Marxists do, is try to throw away, not quite throw away, but try to ignore this, and but at the same time, they insist that they are true Marxists, as both Wittgenbach in his book Die Frankfurter Schule mentions, and I quote this in German, die meisten des Verschulden vertreten, sie glauben, dass ich das war den sozioökonomischen, das war Kern des Marxismus, das war Bewahrten und das war herausgebildet. They not only they predict and they develop the socioeconomic core of Marxism in what they were doing, which was an attempt to show the cultural and the aesthetic side of what they see as the crisis of bourgeois society. Now, the crisis of bourgeois society, according to Marx, is rather simple, right? It is that there is a conflict between human needs and production under capitalism, and this results in an acceleration of the economic crisis, the Veredelung des Proletariats, the suffering and the continuing immiseration of the proletariat, and all of this will lead ultimately to a revolution in which the proletariat will come to power. So it is driven by socioeconomic circumstances. Now, what the cultural Marxists are going to argue is that even if there is this socioeconomic underpinning, what we are really seeing is a cultural crisis. And it is a cultural crisis that has psychic as well as an economic point of origin. People are repressed in bourgeois society. And they are repressed because they're not allowed to express their deepest sexual longings. And the reason they can't is that the capitalist system holds them back. The capitalist system is also wedded to other things that are bad, for instance, to Christianity, which is a repressive religion. And it is wedded to a family structure that is patriarchal. Now, all of these factors are accompanying, say in German, Begleiterscheinungen des Kapitalismus. They are things that accompany the accompanying factors of a capitalist economy. If you have this, you're also going to have all these other things: repressive religion, patriarchal family, sexual ambitions, and sexual ambitions are going to lead to fascist aggressiveness. Now you see, how do you go from the socioeconomic Kernbegriff, for the essential concept of socioeconomic, how do you go from there to all of this other stuff, right? And it's quite a leap, I have to tell you. And most serious Marxists thought these people were lunatics. They were probably right in some sense, because these people were actually addressing problems that were not really socioeconomic. They were addressing the manifestations of a bourgeois Christian society of the kind that existed in the 19th century in Sweden, in Germany, in England, and the United States, and other places. And they hated the society, which they saw as repressive, and they allied themselves with avant-garde movements in art, in literature. But they continue to consider themselves as Marxists for two reasons that seem very obvious. One, Marxism has cachet as a revolutionary movement, right? I mean, this is a movement which claims to be against the bourgeoisie, which looks upon religion as the opium of the people, which call for a revolutionary transformation of the forces of production. So for all these reasons, you're looking at the revolution. It is not that you have 100 revolutionary movements out there. There's a limited number you can pick. One is anarchism. Anarchism seems to be a peculiarly Latin and Slavic phenomenon. It's not very popular in the Germanic world. It doesn't really lead anywhere. You just have assassinations of kings and stuff like that. But the socialists seem to be going somewhere. They have a large movement. And there are revolutionary socialists who want to take power. They have a plan for taking power. So this is the revolutionary movement which you want to become leader. It looks like it's going to go somewhere, right? The other thing that would attract them to Marxism is that Marxism is anti-bourgeois, right? Now, they may not, the true Marxist is not anti-bourgeois because the bourgeois represses you and doesn't allow you to express homosexual urges and stuff like that. They could care less about that. I mean, if anything, the Marxists hate homosexuals. They persecute them. But a fact that is always conveniently forgotten by the left, of course, which glorifies both communism and homosexuality from the vantage point of living in a Western bourgeois society. But in any case, socialism is anti-bourgeois. So you have that as an advantage if you call yourself a Marxist. You may be anti-bourgeois for other reasons, but wanting to overthrow a bourgeois society is basic to Marxism and cultural Marxism. So for all these reasons, or not for all these reasons, for these 2 or 3, I think, interconnected reasons, the cultural Marxists decide to call themselves Marxists. But they also try in various ways to preserve a Marxist socioeconomic framework. And talking about my own life, I had Herbert Marcuse as a professor, and probably one of my best professors, and one of the most tolerant people, because the degree of intolerance in the American university is so stifling that even a Stalinist looks tolerant by comparison to the but Marcuse would always make valiant efforts to defend everything in Marx, Marxist-Leninism, crises of capitalism, and he would say he used to say every word of Marx is true. You know, and I used to joke, and I said, what about Marx's letters that are full of sexist, anti-Semitic comments, all these other things? And well, the letters don't count, but the economic writings are all true. Everything is true. And it's like, some American fundamentalists who tell you that every word of the Bible is true, then they only look at certain things, about the end of the world and so forth. Well, cultural Marxists are the same with Marxism. They'll tell you it's only true, and they go on and talk about the present day. So, I mean, they don't really focus on the economics, and for this reason, I think traditional Marxists look upon them as dangerous heretics. And it is of some interest that there were people like cultural Marxists living in communist countries who were typically persecuted. And they did very well in post-communist societies that fell under the Western leftist ideas. In every country you find, in Poland, Romania, Hungary, these were people very often who admired Jürgen Habermas or one of these other cultural Marxists. They were seen as rebels in communist countries, and then they become sort of anti-communist by default and do very well in post-communist societies. There's one chap named Vladimir Smeneanu from Romania, who is a very important disciple of Habermas, published in conservative publications in the United States because he's anti-communist and he's for American democracy. But he's very clearly bears the stamp, of the Frankfurt School and the second generation of Habermas. So there is, in fact, a very bitter relation. It was in communist countries between the cultural Marxist and the Marxist. And the cultural Marxist suffered grievously under communist regimes. But once you get out of the communist world, they'll very often be pro-communist in Western countries to express sympathy for communism. Now, the most important link between the cultural Marxists in our own times is that we're living in a cultural Marxist era. Whether we look at our universities, You look at TV, if you have the stomach for it. If you feel the misfortune of attending a university, and the even greater misfortune of trying to be an academic in the humanities, I mean, you meet the disciples of the Frankfurt School everywhere. They're not as educated. They don't have the traditional German humanistic education. They're vulgarians, of course. But in a vulgar sense, they are the perpetuators of that tradition of thought. They are generally sympathetic to anything calling itself Marxist, but they're not serious Marxists. And I was speaking to a young gentleman who's at the Universität Wien last night. I was talking about we have the Marxist dialectics. You won't find a single Marxist among these people. They're all cultural Marxists. But they quote Marx. And Marx is like Holy Scripture. It's like quoting the Old Testament or something. They will quote this. It's like fundamentalists quoting 7 days of creation or something. They'll tell you they are Marxists, and they quote Marxist sources whenever, just to show you their bona fides. But when it comes to what they really believe is a continuing cultural revolution, right? That they're still living in the 6th district of the city of sexist. And over there you have a homophobe on the 2nd floor. Dealt with all these remaining social problems. And it is the duty of the state to fight fascism. Because anything that stands in opposition to this perpetual cultural revolution which the state is asked to implement is fascism. And all fascism leads to Auschwitz. Right? I mean, just one goes into the other. It's a natural connection of all these things, right? If you say, well, in a democracy, you should be able to decide how many immigrants come into the country. This is a democratic decision, right? You assume the majority living there have a right to do something on the basis of consensus. No, because if you're making that particular choice, you're expressing a fascist, repressive attitude. So you cannot be allowed to make that. That choice, by definition, is undemocratic. Now, all of this thinking is inherent in the Frankfurt School. It's not this. You don't have to work hard to extract this from the body of ideas they leave behind. And whether you're reading somebody like Erich Fromm in the 1930s, early German writings on studies in utilitarian personality. Various works by Adorno, these ideas are definitely present. You say, well, their ideas were vulgarized, or they were taken out of context. And there is a certain truth in that. I mean, somebody like Adorno, certainly Horkheimer, who had been his collaborator, were far too intelligent to believe, in the ideas of Obama's America, or the Democratic Party, or the Swedish Socialist Party. These were people who were too intelligent to take this as seriously as these ideas, and they were probably a little less radical. I think, in a sense, we have gone beyond the Frankfurt School in the degree to which we honor certain notions that they defended at an earlier time. I always like to tell the story that when I was a student of Marxism at Yale, I was in graduate school. They were organizing some event, some carefully orchestrated event that would lead to a Supreme Court decision making it impossible to ban contraception in the state of Connecticut, where I live. And Marcuse thought this was, what they doing, this is ridiculous. And it says, it's women's rights. And they made a face. Well, here is a father of the Frankfurt School making a face. Well, in a sense, the times had overtaken him. He didn't quite understand, where some of these ideas were going to go. But perhaps the grand old man of the Frankfurt School, Max Horkheimer, whose father had paid for the original Institut für Sozialforschung in Frankfurt in the 1920s, becomes a card-carrying right-winger by the end of his life, finally attacking all social engineering. As evil and strongly anti-communist. So I mean, some of these people do come to understand reality at a certain point in their life. And I like to think that Marcuse was far more intelligent and less totalitarian than the current president of the United States. But there is definitely a continuity of ideas, which I think is undeniable. The idea that by doing certain things, by being traditionally bourgeois, by having a notion of a nation state or the nation that has a right to preserve itself, one is expressing fascist ideas. And this very clearly comes out of the Frankfurt School, particularly the work that it produces in exile in the United States in the 1930s and 1940s. And I think it becomes even more explicit in the work of somebody like Jürgen Habermas in the second generation, who is far crazier than anybody in the first generation. He becomes the dominant social thinker in Europe by the 1970s. And becomes a violent anti-nationalist who favors a socially engineered world government, who wishes to destroy even the remnants of national feeling, bourgeois family attachments, all of these things. You can see the legacy of the Frankfurt School that carries into a later generation. There was a point that I think Lars or somebody raised with me, and it has to do with the Jewish character of the Frankfurt School. And there was a book which came out a number of years ago, actually by a Hungarian Jew in America named Zoltán Tar, dealing with the relation between the Jewish background of the Frankfurt School members and their ideas, their reaction against the bourgeois Christian society. And I think there is something in the theory. I mean, you cannot deny that the vast majority of the Frankfurt School are Jewish. Adorno was actually raised as a Catholic, although I think he was half Jewish on his father's side. His mother was a French Catholic. But the other ones all seem to be Jewish. You read somebody like Erich Fromm, and he is violent opponent of Christianity, Christian society, and there's a kind of traditional Jewish prejudice which is very clearly expressed in his work. The question is to what extent can one see this? And I suppose Kevin MacDonald wrote a book on the critique of critiques or something like that, in which he argues that all of this is an expression of the Jewish background of the authors and is an attempt to sort of get back at a Christian society from which they felt excluded. I do not deny that this is a contributing factor. I think the problem is sort of making it a total explanation. Obviously the ideas that they present are extremely popular. They have purchased in a particular society. They become dominant. They're dominant in the Western world today. Why did all these Christians take them over? Why do they embrace them so happily? To the destruction of their own society. So you sort of have to go beyond the Jewish anti-Christian framework or the Jewish anti-bourgeois framework of the creators, of the architects of the school. But there's also another factor that I think has to be considered here, namely that people may arrive at a certain position and move toward a position because of an ethnic or cultural hang-up. But once they've embraced that position, it takes on a life of its own, and they become committed to the position that they've embraced. And I think here I would make certain types of distinctions. If you look at a group like the neoconservatives in America, you can see the ethnic cultural background from which they come. They never hide it. Their Zionism is usually hysterical. People who disagree with them are all anti-Semites. And so you still have to deal with the question of why do all these American Republicans accept this view, and why do they buy into it? But I mean, and clearly in the case of the neoconservatives, you can see their cultural background. This baggage just comes out all over the place. Now, in the case of the Frankfurt School, I think that is less clear. For instance, when the authoritarian personality was written, which deals with the fascist or bourgeois roots of anti-Semitism, this was written by Adorno and Horkheimer in the United States, which they were paid by the American Jewish Congress, or American Jewish Committee, which is a predecessor of the committee that paid for Commentary magazine, which was the star journal of the neoconservatives. But when they got this money, others like Martin Luther said, why would you work on something like this? This is ridiculous. You know, we're concerned about the crisis of capitalism, not anti-Semitism in the United States. The letters that were written by Horkheimer and Adorno at the time, which is in Regensbach's Frankfurt Schule, make it pretty clear that even they're embarrassed. Just money, they're giving us money to write this and so forth. But it is clear that they do believe in this body of ideas that they help create. You know, they're not just doing this to get back at Christians or to find a place for Jews in the world or something like this. Finally, if you look at, Marxists, traditional Marxists, whatever their background, they do believe in Marxism. So that once you have embraced a body of ideas, once you dedicate your life, whatever is the point of origin from which you move toward that idea, that becomes secondary in the end. And I think in the case of the Frankfurt School, one can find their cultural, sociological background as a critical factor in why they embrace these ideas. But once they've embraced the ideas, they clearly believe in these ideas. They're quite willing, to sacrifice themselves. Of course, the Frankfurt School never really has to make any sacrifice, but of course, many Marxists do, real Marxists do. But the cultural and sociological elements that I think are contributing factors become less important than the body of ideas. As I said, you're always left with the question of why do these ideas become so dominant in American civilization, Western civilization, in the late 1960s onward. And I've always found the argument, well, it's the 68ers, the Swassen-Pal, or something like that. They were the ones who pushed us into this, or the Offensive. I find this to be simplistic. Obviously, these people went out in the end. There was a lot of, government leaders, others buy into it. And I think the explanation is probably multi-causal. There are many factors that lead into the acceptance of a body of ideas, but once those ideas become accepted, there is a system in place which will maintain them. And the system exists today. The government, the media, public educators, right? What we call the cultural industry, they all represent a single body of ideas, which I think, for want of a better word, can be described as cultural Marxism. And even those groups that claim to represent traditions, Christian traditions, whatever, American constitutional traditions, they land up accepting that body of ideas. Maybe in an attenuated form, maybe in a modified form, but at the end of the day, this is the dominant ideas that others are accepting, which the young people accept because they're educated to accept these ideas. Because you turn on TV and you're indoctrinated with these ideas. The opposition becomes simply a variation of the dominant school or the power elite which tries to represent these ideas. And of course, these ideas are not represented as cultural Marxism. They're represented as being nice, being sensitive, being caring, being an anti-fascist. But one only has to scratch beneath the surface, and you see pure cultural Marxism coming out at you, right? There was a time in the United States where being nice and being sensitive meant being a good Protestant and believing in the Bible, right? Now that doesn't mean that anymore. It means being a cultural Marxist. That has become the meaning of sensitivity in the United States, as I'm sure is the case here in Sweden. Well, I don't want to encroach on your time any further. If there are any questions you would like to ask me, I don't know how long my allotted time for speaking is, but probably there are a few minutes left, and I shall be glad to entertain your questions.
We can have 10 or 15 minutes of questions. There's plenty of time.
Am I allowed to do this now?
Yes, please.
Fine, then you may ask me questions. I'll have to, I can only answer haltingly if you ask them in Swedish.
I was just wondering if you could elaborate a bit on your, how have you met the opposition in academia?
What kind of opposition?
Your colleagues that are of this Marxist persuasion, how have they treated you as a conservative in academia?
Well, how was I treated in academia? Dreadfully. No, it was one would expect. You know, I was telling somebody an anecdote before. It's not an anecdote. It's a story that is. I think it's historically. It can be empirically. No longer empirically authenticated, but I will vouch for its truth. When I was finishing college, I was offered a graduate fellowship at Yale, but also got accepted at a top quarter, I suppose, in the United States, top quintile law school. And I decided to take the fellowship to Yale, and my fiancée broke up with me because she thought I was a lunatic. And to this very day, I think she was right. You know, she thought I become a corporate lawyer like my sons. Anybody who does not fully believe in political correctness should not even think of an academic career in the United States. And I think that's also true in the sciences, because you're expected to be politically, you're expected to be so politically correct that even if you're led to one set of conclusions as a geneticist, you have to give some kind of Lysenkoist environmentalist explanation about human behavior. Not even, you have to just totally forswear your science. I used to joke with somebody that I'm purely scientific, and I said, do you accept important hereditary differences between men and women? Oh, that's different. Do you think that different ethnic and racial groups have different levels of intelligence? Oh, no, no, that's different. Obviously, being scientific means what you accept empirical research to whatever extent it's compatible with political practice. You know, even in the sciences, you are controlled. If you're in a mathematics department, wherever you are, you're expected to express politically correct views about everything. And I have no doubt the situation is at least as bad and probably worse in Sweden. Are there any other questions?
How did you deal with that opposition? Were you able to teach classes from this perspective as we're speaking now, or did you have to?
No, I was kicked out of about 10 positions. I've had to move. As I tell people, I've published, I don't know, 10, 12 books. I've published with Cambridge, Princeton. After they publish my books, they never get reviewed, except by, Arctos Press or some other conservative right-wing group. My books are very good scholarship. They're not political, but they do not express the dominant political view. And I do not get reviewed by so-called, I get reviewed less by Republican or so-called the neoconservative press than I do by the left. The left actually review first. So, because I'm more hated by the bogus right, the fake right, than I am by the regular left. No, I was kicked out of jobs. As I tell people, you have the level of tolerance you can expect in Nazi Germany or Stalin's Russia. And I always get sick to my stomach when people talk about the repression of the McCarthy period. Universities were leftist under McCarthy. They were touched, and they should destroy them. They never touched them in the 1950s. There was no repression that took place. One should have taken place. It never took place. I do not pretend to be accountable anymore about this. But what they give you is an entirely fake history, which is even more disgusting. That, we've all suffered. And you find the only people who suffered were card-carrying Stalinists who were not kicked out of universities, by the way. They may have had to get, they were denied security clearance to work for the government military. I mean, it was, this is utter nonsense. I mean, since the 1960s, It has been impossible to work at the university unless you are a politically correct Marxist. And this did not start with the '68 generation. This started with the liberal internationalists who are now neoconservatives. They were almost equally intolerant when they ran the universities before they let in people who were more radically left, cultural Marxist types. They weren't very tolerant either. So what you've had is a perpetual leftist domination, which has simply become crankier and more repressive as time goes on. Yes?
Given that we know that if you bring up these empirical facts that are against political correctness, they're thrown out and they're just called insensitive. You're not going to consider them very insensitive. Is one way to attack the establishment to consider things like the social state of many parts of the United States, deterioration. Detroit's recently almost gone bankrupt. I think it's in bankruptcy. The US is almost finished economically. Is this one way to attack these types without going directly into anything they can rule out as being insensitive?
No, because it always comes to a causal question. So they say, why is Detroit going bankrupt? The answer is that bigoted capitalists or racists are denying them resources or something like that. You cannot get. It's not that these are scientists who have been led astray. You're dealing with ideological lunatics. You're not going to change their mind. They belong in a straitjacket. I mean, you cannot change their mind by giving them facts. They don't believe in facts. The way that I've long tried to deal with this is by cutting off all money to these madmen. But you know, they would get money from the public anyhow. Most Americans do not care what their kids study in college, as long as they go to college. They pay for them. They're usually totally spoiled. You know, they're adults, but they're treated like infants. And the mommy and daddy pay for their education. The parents couldn't care less. Also, the parents are indoctrinated by TV, by the movies. Even their churches are usually very leftist. So they at least at the theoretical level, since these people can theorize, accept the same the same ideas, the same sentiments as the ones that their kids are taught. But at least if the government spigots were closed for a while, there'd be less money. Of course, they would complain. The state in which I live, Pennsylvania, had a fairly decent, they elected a fairly decent man as governor, who was going to make slight cutbacks on the money being allotted to state universities. And in the end, it turned out to give more money, but not as much as they wanted. And he's being violently attacked by the media, everything, because he hates education. One has to also consider that most, or I can say most, a disproportionate amount of money that is earmarked for education lands up in the hands of administrators in the United States. It's a top-heavy administration. So he'd be denied, by denying more money to college administrators, you hate learning. I mean, this is obviously what the media teach us. When people ask me, I say, yes, I hate learning. I don't want to give you any money for learning. Well, for what you call learning, I don't want to give you any money for it. Or people say you're a fascist. My answer is yes, I'm a fascist.
There is time for one more question.
One more question?
Yes.
Yes.
Why did this happen? How did they become the establishment? How did they replace the traditional establishment?
Well, I think at least in the United States, the government, education, they were all moving toward the left for a very long time. I think in a sense the Second World War accelerates it because this becomes a kind of world struggle against fascism. So that everything that's anti-fascist is good. And it's not just a question of what Hitler did, it's what you attribute to Hitler. You know, that Hitler was a sexist. It's not even clear that he was a sexist. Or he hated blacks. He probably never expressed any views on it. But whatever you could attribute to fascism or Nazism becomes evil. And the purpose of education is to cleanse you of any ideas that might lead you in this direction. The government becomes a managerial state. I wrote a book called After Liberalism, which Princeton published about 13 years ago, which makes the argument that the government is taken over by a managerial class that believes in the pseudoscience of government and is already sort of armed with these sort of leftist social engineering ideas which become dominant in the way the state deals with us. So that the government is taken over. It's taken over in most of Europe in the 1960s by the same class. Sweden, of course, is much earlier. Sweden is a forerunner of this. The government is moving left. Universities are definitely moving left. Public education is. And then in the 1960s, this all becomes accelerated. And this cultural Marxist mindset or ethos is already present, I think, by the 1970s in the United States. And it probably comes here around the same time. But it's not that, there's a flip-flop. It is moving in this direction. The process will simply become accelerated at a certain point. Now, is there any other questions or anybody who just, before I sit down, you go ahead.
For all its faults, would you agree that this cultural Marxist development could be used by us on the right? I mean, their methods,
Yes.
methods and perspectives
Oh, absolutely.
used against their...
No, as somebody who's been accused of being, the only right-wing member of the Frankfurt School, I would have to say that these ideas definitely have use for the right. Horkheimer, for instance, was very critical of managerial government, which he saw as a form of oppression. They're very critical of the Enlightenment, the ideas of rationalism, rationalization of society around the Enlightenment. There's many very sound notions or analytic concepts that you find in the early Frankfurt School, particularly, which I think have use on the American or the European right today. And I think people on the right should, by all means, avail themselves of those ideas.
So it would be useful to read the primary, so the literature of the first generation cultural Marxists.
Yeah.
But ignoring the rest.
Yeah, but of course, once you apply them for right-wing purposes, you're going to be rejected.
We don't care about that. We care about
Right.
our own cause.
Yes, no, I think they definitely have use. Just the way Samuel Francis, who was an American right-wing thinker, was very much influenced by Gramsci. I think that people on the right should, by all means, make use of sound ideas or sound conceptual approaches that arise on the left. In the United States, by the way, this is unknown on the right. What there was, you have kind of, many of the paleoconservatives, the older right, they were like wedded to certain classical ideas. They would always begin by saying Aristotle said, or Thomas Aquinas said. And if you said, let's look at something else, they would all give you a very strange look. There was very little conceptual flexibility, and I think this is one of the serious defects of the old right.
I am very sorry to have to interrupt this question and answer session